Did you know that Adam and Eve might have actually been black? That's right, the origins of humanity, as described in the Bible, may point to a very different image than what we often see. In today's video, we'll explore the origin of black people. This could change everything you thought you knew about the Bible's earliest characters. Stick around, because we have literal proof. Now, if you have watched my videos, you know that. I've made several videos discussing the idea that Jesus wasn't the typical white depiction we often see. But every time I get comments saying, yeah, Jesus may not be white, but he's not, black. Well, today we're going beyond that question to explore the biblical origins of black people specifically. Now, the truth is, for many of us, society has shaped our view of the Bible's key figures. When we read the Bible, we tend to picture them as either white or Middle Eastern. Rarely do we imagine them as black, even though Africa has some of the world's oldest and largest Christian communities. In fact, if you search online, many sources might tell you that the United States is the largest Christian nation. But when we look at the numbers and the history, Africa is undeniably home to one of the deepest-rooted Christian traditions. The numbers speak for themselves. Africa has a population that's over 338% larger than that of the U.S., with around 734 million Christians across the continent, while the U.S. population is approximately about 333 million in total. This means that Africa's Christian population alone is more than twice the entire population of the United States, despite challenges in keeping consistent records across such a vast and varied continent. Africa remains one of the most influential Christian hubs in the world. Historically, Africa was where Christianity initially took root, with figures like Ethiopian eunuchs and Egyptian scholars embracing the faith even before many parts of Europe. From there, Christianity spread throughout the entire world. So that's to tell you that the origin of the Abrahamic religion started its root in Africa. This isn't just about numbers. It's about the origin and spread of belief itself. Africa's role in the rise and spread of Christianity is unmatched. It's a powerful reminder that Africa's relationship with Christianity isn't recent or secondary, but foundational, going back to the earliest days of the faith. So let's dive into what the Bible and historical context might reveal about the origin of black people according to Scripture. Often when discussing the origin of black people in the Bible, people jump straight to Noah and his sons. But to really understand the biblical perspective on this, we have to go all the way back to Adam and Eve, the very first humans God created. This is where the story of all humanity begins. Now, of course, we can't say with 110% certainty what exact skin color Adam and Eve had. But by tracing back our roots and looking at the facts we know today, we might say we're about 109% sure. Let's start with what we do know. The Bible describes Adam's creation in Genesis 2:7.
Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life.
The Hebrew word for ground here is Adamah, which is often associated with rich, dark soil. Not just sand, but rich, dark soil. If you're wondering what rich soil looks like, try this. Go outside, find some grass, and dig a little under it. There you'll find the rich, dark soil that represents the original soil of the earth. This is the same soil God used to create Adam. And here's something fascinating. Yahweh didn't make it hard for us to understand this connection. The name Adam actually means man, and it's directly linked to Adamah, the Hebrew word for earth or ground. So in essence, Adam is a man formed from the soil of the earth. This essential fact has led some scholars to suggest that Adam's skin tone may have been dark, reflecting the color of the earth from which he was formed. All right, let's do a quick lesson on soil. Africa is known for having rich, fertile soil, which often appears in darker shades. Generally, the darker the soil, the healthier and more nutrient-rich it is. However, if you visit rural areas in Africa, you might notice that the soil has a reddish tone or even appears fully red in some places. Now, this doesn't mean it's less fertile or that it blushed into a red hue. That red tone comes from iron oxide in the soil, which is common in tropical and subtropical regions. This type of soil is still incredibly rich, especially when it's hydrated, and it turns darker when wet, revealing just how fertile it really is. I point this out because the name Adam itself is linked to the Hebrew word Adam, meaning red or ruddy. I don't want people to get this red confused for tomato red, but the red undertone of some soil known as laterite soils. This etymology has been interpreted by some to indicate a reddish-brown complexion, further supporting the idea of a darker skin tone. Now, this idea literally proofs Adam's skin tone. There should not be any argument about it. Black people originated from Adam himself. If you still don't understand, start the video over and just rewatch this section. But if you're looking for more proof, let's move on to the next section. From a scientific perspective, genetic research indicates that all humans share a common ancestry tracing back to Africa. The Out of Africa theory posits that modern humans originated in Africa before migrating to other parts of the world. Given that early humans evolved in equatorial regions with high UV radiation, it is likely that they had higher levels of melanin, resulting in darker skin tones. While the Bible does not provide explicit details about Adam's physical appearance, these linguistic and scientific insights suggest that the first humans may have had darker skin, aligning with the characteristics of early human populations in Africa. As we explore the origins of Black people in the Bible, it's essential to keep in mind a few key points about history itself. First, many cities and countries we read about today have undergone name changes over the centuries. Whether through war, leadership changes, or cultural shifts, these name alterations make it challenging to pinpoint exact locations and identities for ancient peoples. Take, for example, biblical cities like Akko, which later became Ptolemais, or Ashdod, known afterward as Azotus. Another critical point is that historical narratives often reflect the views of those who record them. In many places, including the United States, history books may present information in a way that aligns with national interests. This sometimes means omitting certain details or subtly altering perspectives to put a particular narrative in a positive light. Because of this selective representation, many people have come to visualize biblical figures as white, overlooking the diversity that actually characterized the ancient world. Keeping all of this in mind allows us to approach the Bible and its characters with a more accurate understanding. It helps us recognize potential biases in how history has been told and appreciate the broader cultural and ethnic diversity present in these ancient narratives. While it's true that we don't have a recorded physical description of Adam, science provides some fascinating insights that align with the idea of early humanity being dark-skinned. First, let's look at genetics. Scientific research shows that all humans trace their lineage back to a single origin, and that origin points to a region in Africa. Geneticists have found what they call mitochondrial Eve, a common ancestor shared by all humans, whose genetic markers suggest she lived in Africa. This discovery is powerful because it ties directly to the biblical account of a first human couple, aligning science and faith on the shared ancestry of humanity. Now, if Adam and Eve were indeed created and lived in this region, it makes sense that they would have possessed higher levels of melanin. Melanin is the pigment responsible for the color of our skin, hair, and eyes. And it's essential for protecting against the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Since early humans were likely exposed to intense sunlight, they would have needed higher melanin levels for protection, leading to darker skin tones. This idea isn't just a loose theory. It's supported by biology. The more melanin you have, the darker your skin, and this trait is particularly advantageous in areas with strong sunlight, like Africa. So based on both scientific evidence and the geographical clues in the Bible, it's quite likely that Adam and Eve, and by extension the earliest humans, were black or dark-skinned. This understanding brings us closer to seeing the Bible's early characters in a more historically accurate light. Let's place close attention to this part, and you can even research this to make sure it is accurate. In 2008, Professor Yair Ben David of Tel Aviv University conducted a pioneering study on the physical appearance of ancient Israelites, collaborating with scientists from the Russian Foundation of Fundamental Investigation. He performed facial reconstructions on skulls from the Second Temple period, approximately 516 BCE to 70 CE. His findings suggested that the inhabitants of Judea during this era may have had features more akin to those of Black Africans. This research challenges long-standing assumptions and encourages a fresh look at historical depictions, showing that early populations in the Middle East likely had a wider range of skin tones and features than is often represented. Historical and archaeological evidence indicates that ancient Egyptians were predominantly dark-skinned, aligning with the diverse populations of northeastern Africa. Ancient Egyptian art often depicts Egyptians with reddish-brown skin tones, distinct from the darker representations of Nubians and the lighter depictions of Libyans and Asiatics. The Book of Gates, a New Kingdom funerary text, categorizes people into 4 groups: Egyptians, Asiatics, Nubians, and Libyans. In this text, Egyptians are portrayed with reddish-brown skin, suggesting a complexion darker than that of Asiatics and Libyans, but lighter than Nubians. Additionally, genetic studies of ancient Egyptian mummies reveal a complex ancestry with significant African components. A 2017 study analyzing DNA from mummies found that ancient Egyptians shared genetic ties with populations in the Near East and Sub-Saharan Africa, reflecting the region's historical role as a crossroads of diverse peoples. These findings underscore the ethnic diversity of ancient Egypt, highlighting its connections to both African and Near Eastern populations. Such evidence challenges modern misconceptions and emphasizes the rich multicultural heritage of ancient Egyptian civilization. With all of this being said, the early people of the Bible were mostly black-skinned Africans, but as time went by, this changed and the world became more diverse. I mention this because even though environment plays a role in our appearance, genetic is more powerful than environment. All right, let's break this down. People with the darker skin have a kind of genetic toolbox that allows for a full range of human skin tones in their descendants. This is thanks to melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color. More melanin means darker skin, and those genes can carry a lot of variation that gets passed down through generations. Now, here's where it gets interesting. 2 light-skinned people generally won't have a child with darker skin unless there's a recessive gene for it. But for this trait to reappear, it could take several generations and a whole lot of genetic mixing, as it's not very common in populations where light skin is the dominant trait. This suggests that the wide range of skin colors we see today likely came from ancestors with darker skin, whose genetics allowed for different shades to develop over time. So in a way, the genetic diversity we see across humanity has roots in those early, darker-skinned ancestors. Let's break it down with a simple example. Imagine a pair of dark-skinned parents. Since their genes have a lot of melanin variation, they could potentially have children with skin tones ranging from very dark to lighter shades, depending on which genes get passed down. This is like having a paint palette with a lot of rich colors. You can mix and get various tones, but all starting from those darker base colors. Now, if you take 2 light-skinned parents, it's like working with a more limited palette. They can pass down light skin tones, but producing a darker skin tone would require both of them to carry a recessive gene for higher melanin, something that isn't common in populations with predominantly light skin. So for a darker shade to suddenly appear from 2 light-skinned parents, it would likely take many generations and rare genetic factors coming together. In simple terms, darker-skinned ancestors had a wider genetic toolbox for skin tone diversity, which is why we often see a full spectrum of skin colors originating from them. This is also why many scientists trace human ancestry back to Africa where the warmer climate and natural selection favored melanin-rich skin. When two light-skinned parents have a child, that child will typically have a lighter skin tone as well. Black individuals can also have children with albinism, meaning the child may have very light or white skin, but with distinct black features. Genetics play a powerful role in this. If someone is born with albinism, even growing up in Africa won't darken their skin because their melanin levels are set from birth. This concept helps explain why white people in South Africa remain fair-skinned, or why people in Dubai have naturally brown skin despite extreme heat. Their genetic makeup is already determined and doesn't change with the environment. Colonization, war, and the takeover of countries have led to different groups ruling in various regions. But this gives you an idea of how skin tone remains consistent within genetic boundaries. Pause. Do you want to read the Book of Giants? Or the Book of Adam and Eve? Maybe even the early life of Jesus? Lucky for you, we are launching a weekly newsletter packed with powerful stories from apocryphal texts. Plus, you'll get a Bible verse to pray over each week. Don't miss out on these hidden treasures of faith. Check the link in the description box to join. Also, don't forget to subscribe. Let's return to the video. It's important to remember that although the origin of humanity, including Black ancestry, began with Adam and Eve and is often traced back to Africa, Africa itself did not remain a continent populated exclusively by Black people throughout history. Over the centuries, like I mentioned earlier, colonization and migration brought diverse groups of people into the continent, which is why we see a variety of skin tones and ethnic backgrounds across Africa today. So while Africa's history and climate contributed to its early human populations being rich in melanin, factors like migration, colonization, and genetic inheritance have diversified its demographics over time. Before we move to the next point, let's summarize what we've covered so far. The origin of Black people, according to Genesis, begins with Adam. Adam was created from the soil of the earth, a rich, dark substance. This suggests that the earliest humans likely had darker skin. Over time, as populations spread and adapted to different environments, the melanin levels in people's skin evolved, leading to a range of skin tones and even conditions like albinism. This genetic diversity has created the variety of skin tones and features we see today. Now, some might argue, Adam or Abraham couldn't have been Black because they were Israelites or Jews. But it's essential to understand that Jew isn't a race, it's an identity tied to a faith and a tribe, not a skin color. The Hebrews, including Abraham, were Middle Eastern, but their origins trace back to the same soil, with genetic diversity growing over generations. Did you miss that? Okay, let me repeat it for the people in the back. Being an Israelite or Jewish isn't about race or skin color. It's about spiritual and tribal identity. In the Bible, the term Israelite referred to the descendants of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and the 12 tribes that came from his lineage. It identified a community that worshiped Yahweh, distinct from neighboring groups who often worship multiple gods. Their devotion to Yahweh set the Israelites apart, both spiritually and culturally rather than racially. Now let me repeat that again. Being an Israelite or Jewish isn't about race or skin color. It's about spiritual and tribal identity. In the Bible, the term Israelite referred to the descendants of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and the 12 tribes that came from his lineage. It identified a community that worshiped Yahweh, distinct from neighboring groups who often worshiped multiple gods. Their devotion to Yahweh set the Israelites apart, both spiritually and culturally, rather than racially. Historically, many of God's people faced persecution and were isolated from other nations. In Genesis 15:13, God tells Abraham that his descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. This prophecy, fulfilled in Egypt and later in other captivities, highlights how the Israelites endured slavery and isolation, not because of race, but because of their unique faith. Moreover, Jewish identity today includes people from diverse racial backgrounds, from Ethiopian Jews to Ashkenazi Jews, showing that Jewishness transcends ethnicity. This aligns with the biblical understanding that the Israelite identity was about one's covenant with God, as seen in Romans 2:28-29, which states,
For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly.
So, while many Jewish people today are pretty much white due to historical migration patterns, being Jewish has never been about race. It's always been about a relationship with Yahweh and the spiritual lineage that started with Abraham and continued through Israel's tribes. The Bible itself shows that the Israelites came from diverse backgrounds, unified by faith, not appearance. The origin of Black people, as we've discussed, begins with Adam and Eve, who were likely dark-skinned based on where they were created and how they were created. However, there is something interesting that I would like everyone to think about. What I am about to mention might let you know that many of the biblical characters held the same skin tone. In the book of Enoch, it gives an unusual account of Noah's birth that shocked his family. Okay, so when Moses returned to Egypt to lead the Israelites out of slavery, or when Abraham visited Egypt earlier, there's no indication in the Bible that either of them stood out because of their appearance. This is significant because Egypt was historically populated by dark-skinned people. Had Moses or Abraham looked dramatically different in skin tone, it's likely that the texts or traditions would have mentioned it. Take Moses, for example, raised in Pharaoh's palace. If his appearance had been markedly different from the Egyptians, it would have likely been noted either in the biblical text or in Egyptian records. Instead, Moses was raised without any remark on a unique physical appearance that set him apart. This silence suggests that Moses blended in physically, lending to the idea that he shared a similar skin tone with the Egyptians, who were, by historical accounts, dark-skinned. Similarly, Abraham's travels to Egypt are described without any indication that he was treated as an outsider based on appearance. Given Egypt's interactions with neighboring regions, they would have been familiar with various skin tones. However, for both Abraham and Moses, any drastic difference would have likely warranted comment or explanation, which we don't find. This historical context aligns with the notion that both Moses and Abraham likely shared features common among the people of that time and region, suggesting that their appearance was familiar to the Egyptians. The Book of Enoch provides an intriguing perspective on Noah's unique appearance, suggesting he might have been albino or somehow visually distinct. In 1 Enoch, Noah's father Lamech is startled and even fearful upon seeing his son for the first time, as Noah's appearance was unlike anyone else in his family. Noah is described as having skin that was white as snow and red as a blooming rose, with hair white like wool and eyes that glowed. This description is remarkable because, in that era, there was no one with such an appearance, so Noah's birth stirred concern and suspicion. Here's how it's written.
His body was white as snow and red as the blooming of a rose, and the hair of his head and his long locks were white as wool, and his eyes beautiful.
Some scholars interpret this description as implying that Noah was albino, or at least had significantly lighter features compared to his darker-skinned ancestors. Noah was described as having locks and hair that is like wool, the same way Jesus' hair was described in the Bible. This unique description might seem unusual, but albinism can occur in any population, including those with predominantly darker skin. This account could signify a genetic variance appearing within Noah's family, setting him apart visually from the generations before him. Interestingly, this unique appearance did not just surprise his parents, but led his father to question Noah's lineage. However, the Book of Enoch explains that Noah was indeed fully human and chosen by God to lead humanity after the flood. The story of Noah and his distinct appearance reminds us that, despite variations, all humans trace their lineage back to the same origins. Noah's albinism, or light appearance, didn't change his ancestry or diminish the genetic diversity that had been established from the beginning with Adam and Eve. In tracing back the biblical origins of Black people, everything we've explored, from the creation of Adam to Noah's descendants, points to a story that began with dark-skinned individuals. Starting with Adam, created from the dust of the ground in a region rich with dark, fertile soil. We see that the first human likely had a skin tone reflecting his environment. Science and genetics also support this, showing that all human diversity we see today could have originated from a darker-skinned population. Noah, who may have been albino, according to the Book of Enoch, further influenced this diversity. His unique genetic characteristics could explain why his 3 sons, who would go on to populate different regions, had offspring with various skin tones. This diversity continued to expand as humanity spread out across different lands, regions, and climates, adapting and changing over generations. In the end, the biblical record, alongside scientific and historical evidence, reveals that humanity's origins are deeply connected to Black ancestry. While history has evolved and shifted, our understanding of these roots gives a richer, more inclusive picture of who we all are, uniting us through our shared beginnings. So as we look back at these ancient stories, it's a powerful reminder that diversity itself is woven into our very creation, a beautiful mosaic that began with Adam and continues in each of us. Hopefully you were able to learn something new. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe.